right, guys, we're going to be reading our first short story today. So this is called The Pot of Basil. It's by a man named Giovanni Boccaccio. He was a very famous writer in the mid to late 1300s. So this is a very old story, but it's so weird. And it's one of my favorite ways to start class. And it kind of works better if you treat it like those really bad soap operas that come on in the afternoon, which you're probably watching now that you're home 3 days a week and you have nothing else to do. No, I take it back. You're watching TikTok. But back in my day, you would have been watching daytime TV because that's all that would have been on, and you would have been better for it. But this story is very strange. But yeah, so if you treat it like a soap opera and you gasp and think of like really crazy musical cues coming in and things like that, I find that it makes it much more interesting. But we're just going to read through it, and then you guys will have a discussion question, a journal entry, and a discussion question, a journal entry, and a soapstone to deal with in terms of your practice of the pot of basil. And yeah, hopefully you'll enjoy it. So we're going to skip the first two paragraphs because all they do is introduce the framing narrative. So this is kind of like there's like a bigger story where there's a bunch of people telling stories, and this is one of the stories that they tell. So those first two paragraphs deal with that. In Messina, which is in Italy, there once lived 3 brothers, all of them merchants who had been left very rich after the death of their father, whose native town was San Gimignano. They had a sister called Lisabetta, but for some reason or other, they had failed to bestow her in marriage, despite the fact that she was uncommonly gracious and beautiful. So this first paragraph tells us a lot of things. We have four characters. We have the 3 brothers and their sister, Elisabetta. When it says that they had to fail to bestow her in marriage, that tells us that we're dealing mostly with arranged marriages. Like, I'm not choosing, if I'm Elisabetta, I'm not choosing who I'm marrying. My brothers are choosing who I'm marrying, which means that this is much more, less of like a love thing and more of a power thing, right? Women, in particular in the 1300s, were seen as ways to gain power for their family. So you were marrying somebody richer than you or more powerful than you so that you could improve your family, basically improve her brothers' lives, even though they had already been left very rich after the death of their father. The fact that we also learned that she is gracious and beautiful. So we've got a lovely lady here. In one of their trading establishments, the 3 brothers employed a young paisan, who's like a worker, named Lorenzo, who planned and directed all their operations and who, being rather dashing and handsomely proportioned, had often attracted the gaze of Lisabetta. Having noticed more than once that she had grown exceedingly fond of him, Lorenzo abandoned all his other amours and began in like fashion to set his own heart on winning Lisabetta. And since they were equally in love with each other, before very long, they gratified their dearest wishes, taking care not to be discovered. So we've got love, you guys. So there's a hot guy who works on the brother's farm. Like, paisan's like a low-level worker. And his name's Lorenzo, and I imagine he has like a sexy mustache, and Lisabetta just like can't stop looking at him. He's so pretty. So Lisabetta's been making eyes at him, and Lorenzo, who has all his other amours are loves. So Lorenzo's got this like string of ladies, and he decides, I'm going to put all those ladies aside because this lady, Lisabetta, is special. So they're in love with each other, and they have to hide it, right? And the reason they have to hide it is because in terms of social standing, we've got Lisabetta and we have Lorenzo, right? Huge difference. And the brothers aren't going to want her to marry their poor worker because then she's not making them more powerful with her union. So really, this would be entirely useless for them, and they wouldn't be into it. In this way, their love continued to prosper, much to their common enjoyment and pleasure. They did everything they could to keep the affair a secret, but one night, as Lisabetta was making her way to Lorenzo's sleeping quarters, she was observed, without knowing it, by her eldest brother. Bum, bum, bum! The discovery greatly distressed him, but being a young man of some intelligence and not wishing to do anything that would bring discredit upon his family, he neither spoke nor made a move, but spent the whole of the night applying his mind to the various sides of the matter. So first off, what could Lisabetta possibly be doing sneaking into Lorenzo's room in the middle of the night? Huh? They're having sex. So that would have been a big no-no. She's not married, and if you were a lady in the 1350s and you were not virginal, nobody was going to want to marry you. So Elizabeth is doing like a real big gamble here. And the fact that her brother saw her means that he knows he's going to have a hard time marrying her off. But you'll notice the brother doesn't say anything, and he spends all night just thinking it through, which tells us that the brother is smart, he's patient, and cunning. He's going to wait it out. Next morning, he described to his brothers what he had seen of Lisabetta and Lorenzo the night before. And the three of them talked the thing over at considerable length, being determined that the affair should leave no stain upon the reputation either of themselves or of their sister. He decided that they must pass it over in silence and pretend to have neither seen nor heard anything until such time as it was safe and convenient for them to rid themselves of this ignominy before it got out of hand. So when they're talking about stain of that reputation, that's a metaphor, obviously, because you can't actually stain a reputation because it's not a thing you can touch. But they want to make sure that this does not affect her ability to get married. Abiding by this decision, the three brothers jested and chatted with Lorenzo in their usual manner until one day they pretended they were all going off on a pleasure trip to the country and took Lorenzo with them. They bided their time, and on reaching a very remote and lonely spot, they took Lorenzo off his guard, murdered him, and buried his corpse. No one witnessed the deed, and on their return to Messina, they put it about that they had sent Lorenzo away on a trading assignment, being all the more readily believed as they had done this so often before. So the three brothers commit murder. And they do it in such a tricky way. They're like, Lorenzo, buddy, nothing weird has happened, right? They just like kept going on like nothing, like they didn't know that he was banging their sister in secret and that was a problem. And then they're like, hey, let's go out to the country. We'll go like hunting and we'll drink and we'll just have like just the biggest bros week out and it'll be awesome. And instead they murder him and bury him. And then they come up with a cover. They come up with like a what's the word? Alibi. They're like, oh, we sent him on a trading assignment. And in the 1350s, you're traveling by, you're walking, you're traveling by like horse or wagon in a caravan, or you're on a boat. And all three of these were hugely dangerous because all of the waters and the roads were haunted by pirates and bandits just waiting to knock off a merchant who's on his way. So the odds of Lorenzo dying on one of these trips or just disappearing and never returning are really high. So they know that, and they use this to their advantage because they're bad men. Lorenzo's continued absence weighed heavily on Lisabetta, who kept asking her brothers in anxious tones what had become of him, and eventually her questioning became so persistent that one of the brothers rounded on her and said, what is the meaning of this? What business do you have with Lorenzo that you should be asking so many questions about him? If you go on pestering us, we shall give you the answer you deserve. From then on, the young woman, who was sad and miserable and full of strange forebodings, refrained from asking questions, but at night she would repeatedly utter his name in a heart-rending voice and beseech him to come to her. And from time to time she would burst into tears because of his failure to return. Nothing would restore her spirits, and meanwhile she simply went on waiting. Ah, Lisabetta, you are a woman of your time. A 1350s woman only knows how to wait and cry, and that's what she's doing, and just calling his name, hoping that he's going to answer. One night, however, after crying so much over Lorenzo's absence that she eventually cried herself off to sleep, he appeared to her in a dream. Pallid-looking and all disheveled, his clothes tattered and decaying, and it seemed to her that he said, ah, Lisabetta, you do nothing but call to me and bemoan my long absence, and you cruelly reprove me with your tears. Hence, I must tell you that I can never return, because on the day that you saw me for the last time, I was murdered by your brothers. He then described the place where they had buried him, told her not to call to him or wait for him any longer, and disappeared. This is how much Lisabetta is crying. She has woken the dead. All of her screaming out Lorenzo's name and crying has distracted him from the afterlife so much that he had to come to her in a dream, be like, hey, your brothers murdered me. Can you please stop calling my name so that I can sleep? Yeah. Having woken up, believing that what she had seen was true, the young woman wept bitterly because, why act when you can just cry? And when she arose next morning, she resolved to go to the place and seek confirmation of what she had seen in her sleep. She dared not mention the apparition to her brothers, that's probably a good idea, but obtained their permission to make a brief trip to the country for pleasure, taking with her a maidservant who had once acted as her go-between and was privy to all her affairs. She immediately set out and on reaching the spot, swept aside some dead leaves and started to excavate a section of the ground that appeared to have been disturbed. I assume she's doing this with her hands. I don't know if she brought a shovel, if she was prepared for this, but for somebody who spends most of her time just crying in her room, when Elizabeth decides to act, like she acts. She doesn't play around. Nor did she have to dig very deep before she discovered her poor lover's body, which, showing no sign as yet of decomposition or decay, that's nice, proved all too clearly that her vision had been true. She was the saddest woman alive, but knowing that this was no time for weeping, for once, and seeing that it was impossible for her to take away his whole body, as she would dearly have wished, she laid it to rest in a more appropriate spot, then severed the head from the shoulders as best she could, and enveloped it in a towel. This she handed into her maidservant's keeping, whilst she covered over the remainder of the corpse with soil, and then they returned home, having completed the whole of their task unobserved. So Lisabetta exhumes the corpse, unburies the corpse of her dead lover, removes the head from the body, wraps it in a towel, gives it to her maidservant, who's just like, yeah, all right, I guess I'll carry this around for you, and then leaves. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on in this paragraph. And you might think that the creepiest part is like uncovering the body or severing the head or giving it to the maid. But in reality, the creepiest part of all of this is the parentheses that say, it was impossible to take away his whole body as she would dearly have wished. So she didn't just want the head, she wanted the whole Lorenzo, but it was too unwieldy. So instead, she just takes his head, moves the body. Again, this is just like one frail girl, probably in her like teens, because it's 1350s. And she like picks up this, she uncovers this dude with her, I don't know, bare hands, a shovel, maybe, moves him, severs the head, and then moves on. So then we're going to find out what she does with the head. Taking the head to her room, she locked herself in and cried bitterly, weeping so profusely that she saturated it with her tears, at the same time implanting 1,000 kisses on it. Then she wrapped the head in a piece of rich cloth and laid it in a large and elegant pot of the sort in which basil or marjoram is grown. She next covered it with soil, in which she planted several sprigs of the finest salernidin basil, and never watered them except with essence of roses or orange blossom, or with her own teardrops. She took to sitting permanently beside this pot and gazing lovingly at it, concentrating the whole of her desire upon it, because it was where her beloved Lorenzo lay concealed. And after gazing raptly for a long while upon it, she would bend over it and begin to cry, and her weeping never ceased until the whole of the basil was wet with her tears. So, because she couldn't take Lorenzo's whole body and make, like, I don't know, a Lorenzo body pillow to hang out with, she just takes the head, has sweet, sweet makeouts with it, and then because even Lisabetta knows that people are going to question why there's a head on her dresser, she wraps it in a cloth and buries it in a pot and sticks some basil on top of it. She then spends all of her time staring at the basil and crying on it. Because why wouldn't you? You'll note she doesn't go to the police or confront her brothers about the death of her lover. She just hangs out with a plant that reminds her of Lorenzo. Because of the long and unceasing care that was lavished upon it, and also because the soil was enriched by the decomposing head inside the pot, the basil grew very thick and exceedingly fragrant. The young woman constantly followed the same routine, and from time to time she attracted the attention of her neighbors. And as they had heard her brothers expressing their concern at the decline in her good looks, and the way in which her eyes appeared to have sunk into their sockets, they told them what they had seen, adding, "We have noticed that she follows the same routine every day." So the brothers get worried, not because she spends all of her time crying and staring at a plant, but because she's ugly now. And if she's ugly, they're not going to be able to marry her off. So, like, that's what tips them off that something's wrong. So, best brothers of the year over here. The brothers discovered for themselves that this was so, and having reproached her once or twice without the slightest effect, they caused the pot to be secretly removed from her room. When she found out it was missing, she kept asking for it over and over, and because they would not restore it to her, she sobbed and cried without pause until eventually she fell seriously ill. And from her bed of sickness, she would call for nothing except her pot of basil. The young men were astonished by the persistence of her entreaties, because it's a plant, and decided to examine its contents. Having shaken out the soil, they saw the cloth and found the decomposing head inside it, still sufficiently intact for them to recognize it as Lorenzo's from the curls of his hair. This discovery greatly amazed them, I can imagine, and they were afraid lest people should come to know what had happened, that they had murdered somebody. So they buried the head, and without breathing word to anyone, having wound up their affairs in Messina, they left the city and went to live in Naples. Note who doesn't go with them. They leave their crying herself to sickness sister on her sickbed and just bolt. The girl went on weeping and demanding her pot of basil until eventually she cried herself to death, thus bringing her ill-fated love to an end, which is fitting, really. But after due process of time, many people came to know of the affair, and one of them composed the song which can still be heard to this day. Whoever it was, whoever the villain that stole my pot of herbs, etc. So that's the story. Nothing bad happens to the brothers. They literally get away with murder, and all they lose is a sister who wasn't really worth all that much anyway. Elizabeth cries herself to death because she died as she lived, and you got to give her that. So you're going to be completing, like I said, a discussion question on this and a journal entry and a soapstone. So we'll have 3 things to do with this. I'll explain the soapstone in a different video because this one's already getting kind of long. And as always, if you've got questions, ask me. I'm around. Bye.